In the middle of 15th century Europe, when kingdoms clawed against each other for survival and empires rose and fell with the turn of a sword, there emerged a man whose name would become a whispered curse, a shadow in the chronicles of human cruelty. His name was Vlad III of Wallachia, remembered to the world as Vlad the Impaler. To some, he was a hero who defended his homeland against the Ottoman Empire, standing like an iron wall against invasion. To others, he was the embodiment of cruelty, a ruler who made punishment into a theater of horror. But to truly understand Vlad's reign of brutality, we must step inside the time he lived in, a world where power was often secured by fear, and where those who ruled believed that mercy was a weakness. It was a world of shifting loyalties, of betrayals whispered in candlelit courts, of peasants who starved while nobles feasted, and of empires that swallowed nations whole. Vlad was born into this darkness, and in that crucible, he learned a chilling truth. Survival demanded more than strength. It demanded terror. His childhood had already been carved by pain and betrayal. Taken as a hostage by the Ottoman Turks at just 11 years old, he learned what it meant to live under the constant threat of violence. He saw how fear bent men's wills. He witnessed torture, humiliation, and executions, and deep within him, something hardened. When he finally returned to Wallachia to claim his throne, he did not come back as a boy. He came back as a man forged in captivity, determined to rule with such ruthless power that no one would ever dare chain him again. And so began his reign of punishments that went beyond mere execution. To Vlad, death was not enough. Death ended too quickly. What he sought was something deeper. A message, a spectacle, a terror that would outlive the moment. His enemies would not simply fall, they would be displayed. They would be warnings written in flesh and blood, meant to echo into the minds of all who dared oppose him. The method that earned him his infamous name was impalement. It was not a swift or merciful act. A sharpened wooden stake was driven through the body of the condemned, sometimes through the stomach, sometimes through the chest, and at times, in ways too cruel to describe. The stake was then planted upright in the ground, leaving the victim to hang in the air, sometimes for days, their suffering a grotesque display. There is a story, one whispered across centuries, of when the Ottoman Sultan sent envoys to Vlad's court, demanding submission. These envoys refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing their customs. To most rulers, this would have been a slight at worst, an annoyance. But to Vlad, it was disrespect, and disrespect demanded punishment. He ordered that the turbans be nailed to the envoys' heads, driving iron spikes through flesh and bone, so that they could never remove them again. It was not just execution, it was humiliation, a way to strip his enemies of dignity, even in death. To us today, such cruelty feels unimaginable, like something out of a nightmare. But in Vlad's world, it was seen as a kind of justice. He ruled a land plagued by treachery, where noble families plotted in secret, where the Ottomans pressed at his borders, and where thieves and traitors roamed unchecked. To maintain power in such chaos, Vlad believed he had no choice but to become harsher than the times themselves. He punished the poor for stealing, the nobles for betraying, and the foreign invaders for daring to step onto his soil. But in each act, there was always the same theme. Punishment was never just about the one who suffered. It was about those who watched. Imagine walking along a dirt road in Wallachia, the mist curling in the morning air, and seeing hundreds of bodies hanging on wooden stakes, their lifeless eyes staring into nothing, their faces frozen in agony. Imagine the stench, the silence, broken only by the cries of crows. This was the theater Vlad built, and it worked. Enemies trembled before him, and even the mighty Ottoman Empire hesitated at the sight of his wrath. When Sultan Mehmed II marched an army of over 100,000 into Wallachia, Vlad responded with a night attack so fierce that the Ottomans, hardened by years of conquest, recoiled, and when they reached the capital, they found not just resistance but a field of the impaled. 20,000 bodies stood on stakes, swaying like grotesque trees in the wind. The Sultan himself is said to have turned back, shaken by the horror. Yet there is another layer to this story, one that is often overlooked. Beneath the cruelty, beneath the rivers of blood, was a ruler who saw himself as a protector of his people. Vlad's punishments were not reserved only for foreign enemies. He waged war on corruption and theft within his own land. When nobles conspired against him, he executed them mercilessly, sometimes inviting them to banquets only to have them arrested and impaled. Before the night was over, he enforced order with an iron fist, making crime almost impossible under his rule. In Wallachia, it was said that a golden cup could be left in the marketplace, and no one would dare steal it. Fear, in Vlad's hands, became a But here lies the haunting paradox. Where does justice end and cruelty begin? Was Vlad a defender of his people or their tormentor? Was he a hero who resisted the Ottoman tide or a monster who fed on suffering? Perhaps he was both, trapped between the duty to protect and the hunger for vengeance. And perhaps this is why his story has echoed across centuries, because it forces us to confront the darkest question of all. When the world itself is cruel, what does it make of those who rule it? For those of us today who carry the memory of oppression, of lives broken by systems of power, Vlad's story resonates in an unexpected way. His cruelty reminds us of how punishment has so often been wielded not only to correct, but to dominate, to silence, to strip away dignity. Black lives across history have endured their own forests of the impaled lynchings carried out in public squares, chains that bound men and women into slavery, punishments designed not just to kill, but to terrorize entire communities. Vlad's stakes were meant to break the spirit of his enemies, just as whips and nooses were meant to break the spirit of the enslaved. And yet, just as his people remembered him as both tyrant and protector, so too do we remember the complexities of history's darkest figures. For even in the shadow of brutality, there are questions of survival, of dignity, of what it means to resist. Vlad sought to keep his nation free, but at what cost? How many lives were shattered so that fear could reign in his stead? The story of Vlad the Impaler is not merely the story of one man's cruelty. It is the story of how power can twist justice into terror, how rulers can blur the line between protection and oppression, and how, in the echoes of history, the cries of the punished still remind us of the human cost of fear. But Vlad's legacy did not end with his forests of stakes, or the whispers of his enemies. His reign was a storm of contradictions, a tale where brutality and justice walked hand in hand, each feeding the other until they were indistinguishable. To his people, he was both savior and tyrant, a ruler who lifted them from chaos yet held their lives in a fist of iron. And to the outside world, he became the figure of terror itself, a legend that would outlive his body and twist into myth. As the years of his rule deepened, Vlad faced betrayals that cut not only at his throne but at his very soul. Wallachia was a land trapped between great powers, the Hungarian kingdom on one side, the vast Ottoman Empire on the other. To survive, Vlad needed allies, yet allies came with treachery. Nobles who had once toasted his victories plotted in secret to replace him. Families he had trusted turned against him, whispering promises to foreign kings in exchange for wealth or power. And Vlad, who had already known the sting of betrayal as a child hostage, responded in the only way he knew, through terror. One infamous tale tells of a grand banquet he arranged for the Bojars, the noble families who had plotted against him. The tables were set with wine and meat, the hall alive with music and laughter. But once the feast was underway, soldiers sealed the doors, and Vlad's eyes burned with the cold fire of vengeance. He accused them of treason, their protests swallowed by the sound of chains and steel. Some were dragged away to the stake before the night ended. Others, in an act both cruel and calculated, were forced to march hundreds of miles to the mountains, where they labored to build his fortress at Ponari. Many died on the journey. Others collapsed under the weight of stone. Vlad had turned a feast into a sentence, a celebration into a warning. But his war was not only against nobles and invaders. It was against disorder itself. He despised thieves and liars, those who preyed on the weak. His punishments for them were as unforgiving as for kings. A thief could expect to be impaled as swiftly as a traitor. A dishonest merchant might find himself boiled alive, his deceit ending not in profit but in agony. To the common people, this brutality brought an uneasy peace. They lived in fear, but also in a kind of grim safety. Under Vlad, crime all but vanished, for who would dare test a ruler who punished even the smallest betrayal with death? Yet there is something chilling about a peace built on fear. Imagine walking through a village at dusk, the quiet so heavy it feels like stone. Everyone knowing that a single mistake could cost their life. Was this true justice, or was it simply another form of captivity? To live under Vlad's rule was to exist in the shadow of the stake, where survival was bought, not with dignity, but with silence. The Ottomans, however, remained his greatest enemy. They demanded tribute, a payment of gold and submission, but Vlad refused to kneel. His defiance sparked wars that drenched Wallachia in blood. He fought with guerrilla tactics, striking under cover of night, setting fire to villages, poisoning wells, leaving behind nothing but ash and terror. To him, war was not about honor, it was about survival, about using fear as a weapon, as sharp as any blade. And yet, his cruelty became his undoing. His enemies, foreign and domestic, grew to many. Eventually Vlad was captured, betrayed not by the Ottomans but by fellow Christians who feared his reign of iron. He was imprisoned for years, and though he later returned to power briefly, his end was as violent as his life. In battle, surrounded and outnumbered, he was cut down. His head was severed and sent to the Sultan, displayed as proof that the Impaler was no more. But in truth, Vlad never truly died. His story outlived him, twisting into legend, into myth. His name became synonymous with blood. Centuries later, writers in Europe would use his memory to craft the tale of Count Dracula, a creature who fed on human life as Vlad had fed on human fear. The man was gone, but the shadow remained, larger and darker than the life that had cast it. For us, reflecting on his story today, it is not only the horror that lingers, but the questions. What does it mean to punish with cruelty? What is the cost of ruling through fear? And what happens to the soul of a people who must look to terror for protection? Vlad's people remembered him with a strange mixture of pride and pain. He had defended them from foreign domination, and for that they called him a hero. But they also lived in the constant presence of his brutality, and for that they could never escape his shadow. And in that paradox, we see a reflection of our own histories. Across the centuries, across oceans, we too have known leaders who justified cruelty in the name of order. We too have seen punishments that were not about justice, but about spectacle, about breaking the will of a people. The lynching tree, the slave whip, the prison chain, these. Yet even in the face of such cruelty, dignity endures. Black life across history has borne the scars of punishment turned into theater, but also the strength of survival. The enslaved who sang songs in the fields carried dignity in their voices. The men and women who faced mobs with courage carved dignity out of terror. The communities who rebuilt after violence carried dignity in their resilience. If Vlad's story teaches us anything, it is that cruelty seeks to strip away humanity, but humanity has a way of surviving even in the darkest soil. Perhaps that is why his tale remains so haunting, because it forces us to see how thin the line can be between justice and oppression, between protection and domination. Vlad claimed he punished to protect his people, to keep them free from foreign chains. But in doing so, he chained them in fear. And that lesson stretches beyond his time, beyond Wallachia. It asks us, even today, what kind of justice we want to build. Do we build a justice that protects dignity, or a justice that feeds on fear? The forests of the impaled have long since rotted, their stakes returned to dust. The cries of the punished have been swallowed by time. But their echoes remain in the stories we tell, in the myths we build, in the memories of cruelty that still haunt our world. Vlad the Impaler became a monster because he chose to rule by fear. But perhaps the true horror is not his cruelty alone, but how easily cruelty can disguise itself as justice, and how quickly humanity can be sacrificed in the name of survival. For in the end, Vlad's story is not just about one man. It is about power itself, how it tempts, how it corrupts, how it punishes. And it is about us, the inheritors of history, who must decide whether we will repeat his darkness or carve a different path. His enemies perished on stakes, their dignity stripped by pain. But we, who remember them, can still honor their humanity. We can remember that every act of cruelty carries a cost, and that the measure of true justice is not how much fear it inspires, but how much dignity it preserves. Vlad the Impaler ruled with horror, and his enemies trembled. But history belongs not to those who ruled by fear, it belongs to those who endured, who resisted, who lived. And perhaps that is the truest punishment of all for Vlad. That in the end, his terror could not last forever. His reign ended, his stakes rotted, his name became legend, and yet the people ordinary, fragile, human remained. Their survival, not his cruelty, is the true legacy of history.